Dating apps can be a gateway to meet many great and compatible people. But there will be times you come across someone with more nefarious intentions. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Number 1. I'm a teenage guy, and I'm semi-openly gay. This happened a little over 2 years ago, when I'd gotten my first phone. You see, I got a phone way later than most people my age. At first, nothing really changed. I'd already gone years without having a phone, whilst everyone else had one. So I wasn't immediately addicted like most people. Part of that might have been because I didn't have many friends to text, and another part might have been that I was pretty used to not having one in the first place. It takes a bit to get me out of my shell, so it's rare that I meet or become new friends with people. But after a couple of months of having my phone, I started using apps like Tinder, because it was easier for socially awkward me to talk to people over the internet than it was to meet new people in person. I never spoke to the people there for more than a couple of weeks, because I was always too afraid to meet. Eventually though, I caught on to what people were really using apps like Tinder for. They were just looking for a quick screw. I started coming around to the idea when I heard about Grindr. Being the young, lonely guy coming to terms with being gay, I jumped at the opportunity to talk to other people like me. Naively, I thought Grindr was just Tinder for gays. I learned quickly how wrong I was. My experience with Tinder was that usually people around my age pretended to be interested in you. They'd strike up a conversation and ask you about yourself before subtly hinting at a chance of sex. Grindr dropped all pretenses. The dudes there knew what they wanted and weren't shy about telling you. Not to mention they were all much older. I'd always known people were going to get a few years older than me. I'd lied about my age to make the account after all. But it was rare that I'd find someone that wasn't 10 years older than me. So of course, when I met someone who wasn't just interested in one thing, it was a pleasant surprise. His profile said his name was John, and that he was only 18, and that he lived on the other side of town. So within reach, but far enough away that I felt safe. It didn't hurt that he was pretty cute too. John started talking to me, and it seemed like something clicked. He was funny, we had similar interests, and he never asked me about doing it. And whenever I stressed or needed to vent about something, he listened, and usually offered pretty sound advice. So of course, after talking for over a month, I grew to trust him. And one night out of the blue, I decided he should know that I wasn't 18 like my profile said. As if he and I were ever to be a thing, not that it was something we ever talked about, it was just a stupid hope of mine, I wanted to be honest. He took it well and said that he suspected, because of how often I spoke to him about school, and he didn't mind seeing as he was only a couple of years older than me. After that, it felt like we only grew closer. We spoke every day, and I started to tell him more about myself and what I did most days, etc. So when I told him I was going to go to the mall with my friend Lynn to do Christmas shopping, it wasn't weird. Just so that you're aware, at the time on Grindr there was a feature that let you know how far away people were from you. Lynn and I went about our day at the mall and had a merry old time. We eventually decided to grab a bite to eat at the food court, and whilst we were eating, I checked my phone and, more importantly, Grindr. When I looked at John's profile, it said that he was only a few 100 feet away, which was weird since we'd always been a few miles apart. I didn't think much of it, because it was the mall after all. There were hundreds of people there. We had a brief conversation on the app that went something like this. Having fun stalking me at the mall, lol? Him. I was, but now I think I'm more interested in your friend. Me. Arsehole. Lol. Him. Just kidding. You're the one I have eyes for. I didn't think much of it at the time, so the rest of the day went on as normal. But looking back on that now, the conversation does make my skin crawl. Even though we were joking, he never denied the stalking, and according to the app, he clearly was there. He knew what I looked like roughly because of my Grindr profile picture. So, it really isn't a stretch to say that he was watching my friend and I whilst we were shopping and eating. New Year's rolls around, and by then John and I had been talking for what seemed like forever. But on the night that I was with Lynn and my other two friends celebrating at one of their houses, the friend whose house we were gathered at, Nick, had managed to score some liquor and raided the parents' fridge of its beer. So it goes without saying that most of us were drunk. For a little context, Nick lived on the other side of town from me, and my parents had dropped me off at his house to spend the night there. We kept drinking, hooting, hollering, wrestling around, and God knows what else. The countdown on the TV was a few minutes from midnight, so despite our drunken antics, we settled into the couch to watch the countdown. I was next to Lynn on the 3-person couch, with another friend on the other side of him, whilst Nick sat in the love seat by himself. A lot of factors went into what happened when the countdown hit midnight. Most of it was the amount of alcohol I had consumed, obviously, but the proximity along with the wrestling we'd been doing didn't help much either, not to mention my already enormous crush on Lynn. So when the countdown ended, and when I turned to see Lynn looking at me, I leaned in and kissed him, while the other two jumped back and began hollering again. Of course he shoved me away, and yelled at me. He was pissed, clearly, but he didn't make any moves to try and kick my ass. So I took it as a good sign to try and explain myself. He, however, wasn't having it. He told me to get lost and called me a faggot. By then, Nick and our other friend had calmed down and were staring at us. Drunk, embarrassed, and more than a little emotionally hurt, I just got up and made my way to the door. Nick tried to stop me, but the other two didn't say anything, so I kept walking. As I mentioned earlier, I live on the opposite side of town, so I don't really know what idea I had. I just kept on walking in the general direction of where I lived, which might have been an okay plan if I hadn't been drunk, there hadn't been a foot of snow on the ground, and it hadn't been freezing cold. And after walking for a few minutes, I decided to hide in a bus shelter at an intersection to warm up. Whilst I'm warming up, I got my phone out of my pocket and looked at my message on Grindr. Because I'd been too busy being drunk earlier, John and I hadn't really been talking, but I quickly started pouring my heart out to him and telling him that I was going to freeze to death outside. After doing his best to comfort me, he suggested that he could give me a ride home, because the app said I was only a couple of miles away from him, and that he wasn't going to let me freeze to death trying to get home. I'm not proud of it, but because I wasn't in the best state of mind, I agreed and sent him my location. What happened over the next hour was easily the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. A few minutes passed, and a truck slowly pulled up to where I was sitting. I wasn't sure if it was John, so I waited there hoping he would make some gesture or something for me to get in, which of course did happen. The door opened and I took it as my cue, so I had to put a little effort into pulling myself in. Because I was caught up doing that, and it was dark in the truck, I never actually got a good look at the guy at the wheel. I say guy, because he clearly didn't look like what John's profile picture did. The alleged John in question was much older than 18. I'm not good at estimating ages, but he looked at least 50. His face was deeply lined, and he was supporting grey stubble. And his hair was clearly thinning. After staring at him for a minute, he quietly said, "Hi," and grabbed my hand for a shake. His hands were massive, and almost made mine look like a child's hands. He was a heavier set guy, but it was clear that he was strong. Looking back, I think he may have been a construction worker or something. He started driving and we made small talk, but it was clear that I was very uncomfortable, so he eventually shut up. I wasn't trying to be rude, but he clearly wasn't who he portrayed himself to be. We'd hardly been driving 5 minutes though, before I realized we were heading in the opposite direction of my house. I laughed a little and said, "Guess I forgot to tell you that I live in the other direction, on the other side of town." He only responded with a slow, as if he were agreeing, but he didn't make any indication of turning. "I can give you the address," I said after a moment. He looked at me a little at the mention of this, but still didn't slow down. If I hadn't been worried before, I definitely was now. I started looking around to see what I recognized, and I reached for my phone. But just as I was starting to get past the lock screen, he asked what the address was. I calmly told him that if he pulled over, I could pull it up on my phone so that he could have directions. He mumbled something, but did pull into the church parking lot that I recognized and shut off the engine. I was pretty much shitting my pants, but I was able to open my phone. Whilst I held my phone in one hand, my other crept slowly for the door handle. I wasn't going to get stuck in the car any longer, so whilst I pretended to fumble with my phone for a bit, I quickly tried to pull the handle only to find the door was locked. Not a second later, I felt a huge smack on the side of my head that left my ears ringing and my head spinning even more than when I'd been drinking earlier. I was able to unlock the truck door, but not before taking another hard smack in the head, and afterwards, I stumbled and basically fell out of the truck, dropping my phone in the process. After probably taking far too much time orienting myself, picking up my phone to find a completely shattered screen, and trying to stand up, I started wobbling away. I heard John yelling, but I didn't know what he was saying. My ears were still ringing, and I was getting further and further away from the truck. What did register, though, was the unmistakable sound of a truck engine starting. I started trying to make my shaky legs run, but it wasn't going nearly as well as I would have liked. I knew where I was. The church parking lot we'd pulled into was only a few blocks away from Nick's house. So after stumbling some more, and full on tripping once my legs finally started working a little more efficiently. Unfortunately, that had left John more than enough time to drive up his truck next to me with the windows rolled down. He was telling me he was sorry, and to just get in the truck. After realizing that that wouldn't work, he pulled up in front of me completely, almost running me over in the process, and opened the driver's side door. The crazy guy had gotten out of his truck, and I knew he was going to beat me unconscious. Still, my head was getting clearer by the second, and my legs started cooperating with me more and more, so I was able to avoid him and start full-on sprinting out of the parking lot and down the street. I tripped more than a couple of times, mind you, but I was fast enough to get away from John whilst he was on foot. I was scrambling down the sidewalk trying to find my way before John could catch me up in his truck, but all the houses in the area were essentially the same. And even if I hadn't have had any difficulty finding Nick's place, I just couldn't lead John there. I was still running down the sidewalk when I heard John's truck behind me, and deciding there was no way I was going to get away from him in the open like this, I started trying my hardest to run through the snow of a park that I knew would put me on the wrong side of the road to Nick's house, but I had a plan. Knowing he couldn't very well follow me in his truck through the park, and that he'd never catch me on foot, I turned around to see John zooming down the road, presumably to put himself on the other side of the park by the time I'd made it across the snow-covered field, which was exactly what I'd hoped he'd do. I waited a few seconds before making my way back to the sidewalk I had just been running on, and started sprinting down the streets once again. It was only a couple of minutes before I made it to Nick's house, and John's truck was nowhere in sight, but I still looped around and ran through the backyards of the houses on Nick's street, just to make sure he wouldn't know where me or my friends were. When I eventually did make it to Nick's house, I started slamming my hand on his back door as loud as I could without drawing attention to anyone else. To my surprise, it wasn't Nick that answered, but Lynn. For a moment, I was about to start weeping, because part of me figured he'd just slam the door in my face and leave me out there. He didn't, of course. He wasn't a monster, and even though I had pissed him off, anyone could see that I was in rough shape. Lynn hurried me inside and woke up Nick so that he could help me clean up. It was in Nick's bathroom that I discovered just how rough of shape I was in. There was dried blood all down the left side of my head coming from my ear, but as far as any one of us could tell, there was no cut in or around my ear. But what was more concerning were all the huge scrapes on my elbows, knees, and a pretty big one on my forehead. I hadn't thought I'd fallen that hard, but I suppose the adrenaline and the alcohol had dulled my senses enough that I hadn't felt it. They helped me patch myself up. I stripped out of my soaked clothes and borrowed some of my friend Nick's, and I finally had the time to be overwhelmed. I started crying loudly in the living room where everyone was now awake and watching awkwardly. They asked what happened, and I told them some guys tried to jump me. A lie, but somehow it seemed preferable to telling them that I'd let a stranger who I'd been talking to on Grindr for months now, and who had been, by all accounts, a friend to me, pick me up in his truck where he tried to abduct me. I don't know when I got to Nick's house, but it was almost 4 a.m. by the time I decided it was safe to sleep. Unfortunately, I didn't get to sleep in the next day to recover, because we all had to clean Nick's house before his parents arrived. When I woke up though, Lynn was on the floor next to me, a few feet away, but there was a couch open and he opted to sleep on the floor, which had to have been a good sign, and it was, as we're still good friends today. Needless to say, I was pretty much done with Grindr, and deleted the app off my phone pretty quickly. Number 2. I use Tinder pretty frequently, and it's usually cool. Just meeting people, chilling, smoking with most of them, and so I match with this dude named Charlie, and he seems pretty cool. He's really cute, and he plays music which is really appealing to me, as I also sing and play piano. We talk for a little while, and I agree to meet him at his house. Mistake number 1. Why did I think it was a good idea to meet a stranger in their home? I don't drive, so I take an Uber over, and it's a decent way away, so it's kind of pricey. When he buzzes me into the apartment complex, I got this really creepy vibe, but I just shook it off as nerves. I go up to the 3rd floor, and he's standing at the door. Things are cool, we're just chilling, we smoke a couple of bowls, and we're watching a movie. And he makes a move on me and I go with it. We end up on his bed, and we're obviously engaging in adult activities when out of nowhere, he wraps his hands around my neck hard. Now, that's all fine and good with me. I mean, I can dig that in the right setting. But alone at a stranger's house, when he didn't even check to see if it was cool? That's too much. So I literally can't breathe, and I'm fairly certain my face is turning blue at this point, and the look in his eyes is relentless. Not only is he asphyxiating me, he's yelling in my face, "Are you scared?" with this wild look in his eye. And yes, I am absolutely terrified you're going to kill me. I start to struggle, and he was gripping even harder. And I'm not kidding you. I seriously thought I was going to die. By some kind of miracle, I wriggle out of his grasp and start screaming. He's yelling at me to calm down, and I'm frantically trying to get my clothes back on. He grabs my wrist as I'm trying to leave, and I use all of my strength to pull away and slam the door. When I get home, I look in the mirror, and I have some nasty bruises on my neck. I try to cover it up with makeup to no avail. I straight up look like I've almost been strangled to death. Then he started texting me obscenities. Anyway, I blocked him and reported him on Tinder. I wish I could have done more because I seriously think he would have killed me. I've been debating going to the police, but the bruises are gone now, and it is a he said she said thing. But I'm really starting to wonder if I should, because the next girl might not be so lucky. Number 3. Against my better judgment at the beginning of the month, I downloaded Tinder. I matched with a few guys, and one of them was called James. We ended up texting each other and he seemed pretty chill, and pretty into me. He's a decent looking guy, and we seemed to click. He had apparently been in a relatively abusive relationship with a woman, and he wanted to start over. According to him, she had hit him with a frying pan and pepper spray once, and kept going on about how crazy she was. Alright, it happens. So we went out to the movies this past Friday, and I had a great time. We ended up talking for hours, and we hit it off pretty well. I asked about the ex because I was a bit curious as to why he'd stay with someone like that. He didn't say anything positive about her, just that she was crazy, had mental illnesses, and didn't take her meds and that kind of stuff. She had tried to baby trap him, but she had a miscarriage. She expressed relief that she didn't end up with a kid, and said that he had felt obligated to her. Again, I get that. In all, I had a good time. This morning rolls around, and he tells me that he hooked up with his ex last night, and that he was going to try and make things work. Mildly insulting that I lost out to an abusive chick, but whatever. I tell him it's cool, and then he texts me a few hours later saying that she was crazy and thought she was changing, but she wasn't. He kept asking to see me, and he was being very pushy about wanting to see me today. He begged for 5 minutes of my time so that he could explain. I politely told him that I didn't want to be involved with someone who was clearly hung up on his ex. This is where it all goes a bit nuts. He admitted that he still was, but that he wanted to see me today, so that I could meet her, and she could determine if I was better for me than she was, and that she wanted me to be happy, because he and I had a connection. I flipped after that, and told him that the fact that he needed his ex to determine who was right for him was absolutely nuts, and that isn't what love is, and that I wanted no part of it. His ex started texting me after that, and it was non-stop insults and incoherent shit that made no sense. She also dropped the bomb on me that she was his wife. I basically told her to piss off and blocked the number. I went on Tinder to message him, where I called him a piece of shit, and if he was intelligent he'd leave her and never message me again. He started to harass me, saying that I was miserable, because they have a beautiful love together and all this crazy shit. He then went on to say that his wife knows where I work, and that he hopes she doesn't do anything rash, and I told him that if that were a threat, I would gladly go to the police. He then told me that she'd been to jail before, and that she was not afraid, and that she loves him so much, she would mess anyone up just to risk jail time for him, and that she'd kill my friends if they tried to protect me, that she's armed and dangerous. I told him goodbye, reported him, and deleted my Tinder account. I did go to the police, but since it wasn't a direct threat, they couldn't do much. The cop thinks that James was more or less full of shit, and just trying to scare me, since some people love getting off on that shit. He said I did the right thing by blocking him and reporting him, and said that I should keep my eyes open and alert on the people at my job. Scary thing is, James seemed perfectly normal, but he lied about being married, how he felt towards his wife, and he flipped like a switch. His excuse for not being upfront about being married was that they were going to get a divorce. He seemed so docile and unassuming, and the hatred and aggressive attitude was insane. I have to honestly wonder what would have happened if I'd have gone to talk for those 5 minutes. I'm kinda concerned, since they do know where I work, but if either of them try a thing, the cops will actually nail them. It was a terrifying weekend. Number 4. When I am bored, I sometimes hop onto Tinder to meet new and interesting people. I rarely attempt to meet these people in person, and when I do, it's normally just to meet up. Well, this was one of those nights I met a really nice sounding woman who said that she loves caffeine and video games. We were talking for a while that night, and when I was ready to get off and go to bed, she asked if I wanted her number. I didn't want her to have my number, so I said, "No, that's okay. I know where to find you." I meant on Tinder. Fast forward to the next day, when the new Assassin's Creed game originally came out. I had pre-ordered the games months before, and walked into literally the closest GameStop to my house, and guess who I see behind the counter? She had a sheer look of horror on her face, but I hadn't quite figured out it was her. There wasn't much of a line, and I got up to the register and she yells loud enough so everyone in the store can hear, "This is what you meant?" And she stormed off to the back room, and a couple of minutes later, another employee came out and asked me to leave. One thing I should point out is that in person, this girl looked nothing like her profile picture, so I still don't know what's going on. I explained this to the new employee that was there when I picked up my pre-order, and I didn't understand why I needed to leave. They then threatened to call the cops if I didn't leave, so I ended up giving up and leaving. Later, I got a message on Tinder asking how I knew where she worked. I did not respond to this message. Instead, I called the GameStop, explained that I didn't want to upset Kathy anymore, and I had asked if I could move my pre-order to another store. The manager apologized to me and was able to move my pre-order. Even though this is the closest GameStop to my house, I haven't returned, and it will probably be a while before I do.